Officer Bridget McRae led the small, pale woman into the interrogation room. She pulled out a chair for her at the table, then sat down on the other side. She used a pen to write the woman's name, Allison Derby, and her address on a notepad. Then, with a blank look on her face, she said, "Tell me again why you're here." I killed 3 people, and I'm afraid I'll kill again. You need to arrest me right now, Allison said. When did the killings occur? Today, Allison said in a detached tone with a distant look. This all happened today. Whom did you kill? It started with my neighbor, James. He was over at my apartment, helping me with my plumbing. I don't know what happened. One minute he was putting his tools back into his toolbox. And the next, I was standing over his dead body. My kitchen knife was in my hand, and blood was everywhere. I spent the next hour cleaning myself off while trying to figure out what to do. Then James's wife, Clarissa, came looking for him. I could tell she was suspicious, that he and I might have been having an affair. She barged into my apartment and started calling out his name while looking all around. I thought for sure she'd notice his body on the kitchen floor, but she walked right past it, like it wasn't even there. And then I blacked out again. When I recovered, I saw her laying on top of her husband, with her throat slashed. So, you killed your neighbors? Yes. What happened next? My landlord, Miss Harding, knocked on my door a short time later. I knew she was there to collect the rent. And? I opened the door, and I stabbed her right in the stomach without saying anything. She looked at me with the most surprised expression I've ever seen in my life. The next thing I knew, she was lying face up in my living room with her throat slashed. Her eyes were open, glassy like a doll's, staring up at the ceiling. Well, what did you do next? I decided to turn myself in. But why? I didn't mean to kill those people. I don't know why I did it, and I don't want to hurt anyone else. That's why you need to arrest me. Bridget squinted as she looked Allison up and down. Then she stood up and said, "Wait here a minute. I'll be right back." Allison nodded. Bridget exited the room, then walked down the hall to her cubicle and sat at her computer. She opened the National Police Database of Criminal Records. She typed in Allison's name and address and wrote down the results she found. Next, she went over to an open office door on the side of the room. Stenciled on the door's window were the words, Police Chief Anna Polonsky. Inside was a woman in a suit who was reading a document from an open file on her large wooden desk. Bridget knocked on the door. Anna looked up and said, "Yes? Chief, I've got a weird one here." "Oh?" "Her name's Allison Derby. She came in a few minutes ago, confessing to having killed her neighbors and her landlord. She says she doesn't know why she did it." Well, what do we know about her?" "Not much. She has lived at the same address for 10 years and has no criminal history. She said she stabbed or slashed all of her victims with a knife. But I didn't see any nicks or cuts on her hands or fingers like we often see with perpetrators of knife crimes." "Where are the victims now?" She implied that they're still in her apartment. Anna leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling. Then she said, "What do you think?" "I think she's crazy." Anna nodded and said, "I agree, but we still need to check up on her story. Go to the apartment with her and check it out." "Will do." Bridget went back down the hall and opened the interrogation room door. "Ma'am, let's take a ride down to your apartment. I want you to show me the bodies." Allison said, "Aren't you going to arrest me?" "Not yet. We need hard evidence that someone has committed a crime before we can arrest them." "I see. Well, are you going to put me in handcuffs?" "Should I?" Allison used her key to unlock her door, then opened it to let Bridget inside. Bridget proceeded to look around the small one-bedroom apartment. The first thing she noticed was its sparseness. There were no decorations, and only a single chair in the living room, and a bare mattress in the bathroom. You said you live here, ma'am?" she asked. "Yes, I've lived here for several years, but that's not important. You see the bodies, and now you know I was telling the truth. Now hurry up and arrest me." Confused, Bridget said, "What bodies?" Allison's eyes grew wide. "The bodies," she said. "There are 2 in the kitchen, and one right next to where you're standing in the living room." Bridget looked at the floor, all around her. "I don't see any bodies, ma'am," she said. "Not here, not in the kitchen, nor anywhere else in the apartment." Allison shook her head, closed her eyes, and squeezed her temples. Then she stomped into the kitchen, pointed at the floor, and said, "You mean you don't see these 2 dead bodies right here, a man and a woman?" Bridget took a step towards the kitchen. As she moved, Allison gasped and said, "You just stepped across the body. You lifted your leg up over it." Bridget sighed and said, "Ma'am, like I said, there's nothing here. Not in the living room, not in the kitchen. Nowhere." Allison's eyes began to tear up as she put her hands to her face and said, "No, this can't be happening. Why can't you see them? Why?" "Ma'am, are you using any medications or substances?" Allison shook her head and said, "Why can't you see them? You should be able to see them. You should." Bridget turned her head to speak to the police radio. "Dispatch, I'm at a suspect's apartment investigating a potential 187. But it was a false alarm. I'm headed back now." When she turned around, she saw Allison standing in the kitchen doorway. She had an intense look on her face and held a long kitchen knife in her hand. "You're lying about not being able to see the bodies," she said. "I don't know why, but you are. If you want to arrest me, then you leave me with no choice." She raised the knife and screamed, pouncing at Bridget with surpassing speed. Bridget pulled her gun and fired 2 shots into Allison's chest at point-blank range. She collapsed to the floor in a heap, the knife clattering to the ground. Bridget looked down at where she'd fallen and gasped. Laying beneath her were now 2 other bodies. One was a man, and the other was a woman. Blood covered their skin and clothes. "What the?" Bridget said. Then, with her lower lip trembling, she turned her head and looked out into the living room. There, laying in the middle of the carpet, was the body of a middle-aged woman. She had gaping wounds in her stomach and neck, a look of surprise frozen upon her face. Her hand shaking, Bridget reached for her radio. She said, "Dispatch, I need immediate backup on a 187 at my current location. The perpetrator attacked me and I shot her. I believe she's dead." A voice crackled through the radio. "Officer McRae? Your last communication indicated the 187 call was a false alarm." "I know, but I made a mistake. Get someone out here as soon as possible." While she waited, Bridget examined the 3 new bodies in the apartment. They looked like they'd been dead for about a day. A short time later, there was a knock at the door, and then opened. 2 police officers stood in the doorway, their hands on their holsters. One leaned his head into the apartment and said, "Bridget, you in here?" Yes, I'm here," she answered, "in the kitchen." The officers entered and walked into the kitchen. Seeing them, Bridget said, "Scott, Karen, I'm so glad you're here." Then she held her hand toward the floor and said, "The top one is the perp. The others are her victims." The officers looked at each other and then back at her. "Where?" they said in unison. Bridget scoffed and said, "You've got to be kidding me. There are 3 bodies laying right here, and there's another one in the living room." They both gave her strange looks. Karen shook her head and said, "This isn't funny, Bridget." "I'm not joking. There are 4 bodies in this apartment. Why can't you see them? Scott took a step forward and tripped, catching his toe on the leg of one of the bodies. He recovered his footing and continued another few steps. Then he opened a cabinet and looked inside like nothing had happened. Bridget said, "There, Scott, you tripped on the body of a dead man as you walked across the floor." He looked at her like she was crazy and said in a quiet, concerned voice, "No, I didn't." Karen rolled her eyes and shook her head. Then she said into her radio, "It's a false alarm after all. Officer McRae must be seeing things." "No, I am not seeing things. You tell dispatch that there are 4 bodies in this apartment right now." Bridget pulled out her gun and pointed it at Karen, who stood unmoving, staring at her with surprise. Scott said, "Calm down. We'll figure everything out." Then he reached towards Bridget's gun. Bridget pointed it at him and shot him in the neck. He let out a gurgling sound and slid down against the counter, his blood spurting all over the walls. Bridget pointed the gun back at Karen, but Karen pulled out her own gun and shot Bridget in the head. Bridget had pulled her trigger in the same moment, hitting Karen in the leg. Karen collapsed in agony as Bridget fell to the floor, dead. Then Karen sat up against the kitchen doorframe and looked at her leg as blood sprayed out. She reached for her radio and said, "Dispatch, send an ambulance. Officer McRae shot me and Officer Smith. I'm bleeding everywhere. I need help." A voice crackled through the radio. It sounded muffled to Karen as she began losing consciousness. The last thing she saw was a pile of 3 bodies lying in the middle of the floor, next to those of her colleagues. Police Chief Polonsky sat at her desk in the police station, reading the newspaper. She scanned what headlines until she stopped at one and frowned. It said, "3 police officers missing after responding to reported murder." She shook her head as she read the rest of the story. It said, "Police officers Bridget McKay, Karen Johnson, and Scott Smith are missing. They were last heard from after responding to a report of a suspected murder at a downtown apartment. Police say the officers gave conflicting accounts of events at the scene. Then, all 3 ceased radio communication. When backup arrived, they found the apartment empty. Also, the tenant, the landlord, and 2 other people living in the same building are missing as well. Police say they are suspecting foul play.